Camp Anza originated based on the recommendation of Colonel Aird, who was the commanding officer of the Los Angeles Port of Embarkation. And he searched 4 different areas in Southern California to be a staging area where troops could be housed and prepared for shipping off to the Pacific Theater. In April of 1942, he submitted a report recommending 4 areas, one of which was in Riverside. And Camp Anza, the location was selected because it was close to rail lines that could ship the troops easily to the port of embarkation in Wilmington, and it was on relatively flat and undeveloped land, so it would be easy for the Army to develop that land quickly for housing up to 20,000 troops at a time. It was built in less than a year, and by February of 1943, soldiers were being staged at Camp Anza. Civilian employees filled many of the roles that the soldiers fighting overseas were not able to fill, things like plumbing, contracting, the police force, so forth, working in the laundry. Those were filled by employees from the local community. So many of the employees just lived at home and drove into work together to work at the camp. They typically were not housed at the camp. There were many troops that passed through Camp Anza, but there was a core group called the Station Complement, and that was soldiers and officers who were permanently assigned to the camp, and they actually ran the camp and made sure that all of the processes were followed for staging the troops and getting them out properly, getting them fully equipped and finally trained before shipping out. Many of the soldiers that staged out of Camp Anza came from the Midwest and the East Coast and had never seen California before. And when they came in by train and shipped out of the Camp Anza to the Port of Los Angeles, they saw a lot of Southern California and found it quite appealing based on the climate. They talked about how wonderful the orange grove smelled in this area. And I have personal friends whose fathers came through Camp Anza and after the war started their families in the Arlanza neighborhood. A soldier coming into Camp Anza to be staged, prepared to ship out of the port, was not allowed to leave the camp. They were considered already overseas once they came to the camp. Their 10 days would include having their equipment checked out. They were shown how to pack their backpack. They spent some time preparing a will should they lose their life while in combat. And there was a lot of recreational activities to fill the time. Softball, volleyball, bowling were all highly popular activities at the camp to fill their 10 days. The reason the soldiers were considered already overseas is they wanted to make sure that troop headcounts weren't seen by the general public. They didn't want spies to notice troop movements. And so Camp Anza was actually kept rather secretive except for the civilian employees. It wasn't talked about a lot, and certainly not as much as March Field and Camp Hahn. The soldiers who were staging out of Camp Anza didn't get passes to leave the camp. They were kept on the camp for the reasons stated earlier. African American soldiers were kept separate as the military was segregated up until 1948 when Truman did away with segregation in the military. So at Camp Anza there was a separate servicemen's club, and it was called the Colored Servicemen's Club in the jargon of that day. And there was a larger facility, Servicemen's Club, for the non-African American troops. There were separate dances actually held at the camp. On 2 nights a week, regular dances were held, and young ladies from the neighborhood were invited to come on to the camp and be dance partners for the servicemen. On alternate weeknights, the African American soldiers held their dances, and young African American women from the neighborhood were invited to come on camp and be dance partners for the African American soldiers. It does appear that there was some relaxation of segregation during the life of Camp Anza. I've seen photographs as late as 1945 in which African American soldiers are celebrating Christmas in the Servicemen's Club with the white soldiers. So that, together with the fact that the sports teams, this basketball team and the softball team in particular, were integrated teams. And so it did give the appearance that over time the segregation did soften, at least at Camp Anza. The sports teams were made up of the station complement. Those were the soldiers from the Transportation Corps who were assigned. And Bob Beslack was a world-class fast-pitch softball pitcher. And he was kept at Camp Anza. I did get the opportunity to speak to him once, and he told me that he, by right, should have shipped out overseas, but because of his softball talent, he was invited to stay at Camp Anza, and he was part of the color guard that when there were parade activities, he held a rifle next to the American flag in the parades for the soldiers that occurred at the camp. That job gave him an excuse to stay at Camp Anza and enabled him to pitch for the 9th Service Command Championship team, which won the championship 2 years in a row, in 1944 and 1945. Desi Arnaz, famous for the I Love Lucy show in the 1950s, actually was stationed at Camp Anza for a brief time. He was originally only going to pass through Camp Anza on his way to Bombardier School. However, in a pickup softball game on the Sunday before he was going to ship out of Camp Anza, he injured his knee rather severely. And he was laid up in the camp hospital for a while, and it became obvious that he was not going to fulfill the physical requirements that he would need for Bombardier School. He was then put in charge of training at Camp Anza. He states in his autobiography, ironically, that here he was as an English as a second language soldier at the camp, and he was assigned to teach reading to American troops who did not know how to read. He was also involved in presenting the training films that many of the soldiers were shown before they shipped out overseas. Interestingly, Lucille Ball was often seen at Camp Anza visiting Desi Arnaz. And I spoke to one soldier who noticed that after one of her visits, Desi never came back. And he's of the strong belief that she used her Hollywood influence to get him out of his current assignment at Camp Anza, and he was put into entertainment shows that traveled around the country for the armed services. Another celebrity that was stationed at Camp Anza was the actor Sabu. He played in Aladdin in the 1940s, and he also played in The Jungle Book. So he was famous for those movies, but came through Camp Anza as a soldier getting ready to ship out for the Pacific. In reviewing the camp newspapers, it appears that there was a Hollywood stage show of some kind once or twice a month. There was an indoor theater at which Bob Hope actually did one of his national radio broadcasts for his Pepsodent radio program. He did 2 of those programs. Kay Kaiser did a very popular radio program called The College of Musical Knowledge, and he also broadcast a national radio program from the theater at Camp Anza. In addition, an outdoor stage was created, and several shows came through, all of which seemed to have a common theme, which was there were always dancing girls. In addition, there were big band shows, and it was touted in the camp newspaper that the act that christened the new outdoor theater that was created for the entertainment of the troops was a very famous big band headed by Tommy Dorsey. In addition, exhibitions were put on, and some interesting exhibitions that weren't musical in nature but actually sporting in nature was Joe Louis did a boxing exhibition out behind the camp gymnasium, for which all camp personnel were invited to come and watch Joe Louis do an exhibition. He was a highly popular boxer in the 1930s and 40s, and that was quite a treat for the soldiers. In addition, Babe Diedrichson Zaharias was a world-class athlete in several sports, quite often noted for her golfing skills, and she also did an exhibition for the troops at Camp Anza. An interesting occurrence took place on the outdoor stage at the Camp Anza Theater. Lena Horne came out and sang her famous song, Stormy Weather, which was very well received by the troops of all backgrounds. And when she completed her act, Harpo Marx came out, and you may recall that he was noted for doing pantomime. So he never spoke in public. And he completed his pantomime act, and at the end of his act, he broke out of character, and he took a few moments to thank the troops in the audience for their service to the United States and for their fine work in the war effort. It is one of very few documented instances where Harpo Marx actually spoke publicly, and he did so at the theater at Camp Anza.